Far beyond the busy trade routes of the Vantrial Concord, there was a stretch of dark space that most captains avoided, though few could explain why. Old maps called it the Silence Line. Younger navigators thought it was just an old superstition, a border drawn on maps that no longer mattered. The Corvette Dominion did not believe in old superstitions. They believed in strength, and in taking what weaker hands could not hold. Grand Marshal Tavis Rin stood in front of a wide viewport, looking at the dark stretch of stars ahead of his fleet. For years, Dominion scouts had watched this empty border, waiting for a sign of life. There was none. No warships, no patrols, no warning beacons. Just silence, exactly as the name promised. Tavis Rin had grown tired of waiting. His empire needed new systems, new resources, and new glory to keep the council back home satisfied. The old stories about a hidden human empire beyond the line were, in his mind, nothing more than tales meant to frighten off explorers. He gave the order to advance. Behind him, a small fleet of Dominion warships moved forward, their engines glowing bright against the black of space. Sensors picked up a single outpost ahead, small and unguarded, sitting quietly at the edge of a quiet star system. No defense fleet waited nearby. No warning signal reached them. To Tavis Rin, it looked exactly like an old, forgotten colony, left behind by a species too weak to protect it. He was wrong. The outpost, small as it looked, was not what it seemed. Deep beneath its surface, generations of engineers had built systems meant to sleep for centuries, waiting for exactly this moment. When Dominion ships entered weapons range, hidden defense turrets rose from the ground and opened fire without hesitation. The first wave of attackers was pushed back, confused by the sudden resistance from a station that looked abandoned only minutes earlier. Tavis Rin was not impressed. A handful of automated guns did not scare him. He ordered a full assault, and within the hour, the outpost's defenses were overwhelmed. Explosions lit up the dark sky above the small colony as Dominion troops moved in to claim what was left. It should have been an easy victory, a quiet footnote in the history of Dominion expansion. But before the last defense tower fell silent, a single transmission left the outpost. It was short, encoded, and sent on a frequency that had not been used in 300 years. It did not go to any nearby system. It went far deeper into space, past dozens of quiet systems that carried no name on any Dominion star chart, toward a place the wider galaxy had almost forgotten existed. Inside the ruins of the outpost, a young technician named Owen Fairweather crouched behind a broken console, watching the lights above him flicker and die. He was not a soldier. He had grown up on this quiet colony, tending machines that had never once been used in his lifetime. His grandmother used to tell him stories about a time long ago, when humanity fought a war so terrible that entire star systems were left empty afterward. She always ended the story the same way. We built the wall of silence not because we were afraid, but because we understood what real strength costs. Owen had never truly believed those stories were more than bedtime tales. Now, with enemy soldiers moving through the corridors above him, he understood they were not tales at all. They were history, carefully hidden, waiting for a moment like this one. He was captured before the last defense system failed completely. Dominion soldiers took him and a handful of other survivors as prisoners, more curious about them than concerned. To their eyes, these were simple, unarmed colonists, hardly worth studying. Tavis Rin ordered a brief interrogation, mostly out of curiosity about the strange defense systems his fleet had encountered. Owen said very little. He had nothing useful to say, and even if he had, he would not have said it. Instead, he watched the Dominion soldiers moving through what remained of his home, calm on the outside, though his mind kept circling back to one thought. Somewhere out there, his grandmother's stories were about to become very real. Far beyond the edge of Dominion space, on a quiet world hidden behind layers of old defenses and even older agreements, an alarm broke the silence for the first time in living memory. Officers who had spent their entire careers training for a war they never expected to fight suddenly found themselves staring at a message none of them had ever seen activated before. It carried a single code, old and simple, meant to be understood by anyone trained to read it. An outpost had fallen. The silence line had been crossed. Admiral Elias Bowen received the report in the middle of a routine fleet inspection. He read it twice before setting the datapad down. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Around him, junior officers waited, unsure what kind of response to expect from a man known for staying calm in every situation. Finally, Bowen spoke, his voice steady and quiet. "Prepare the fleet for departure. It seems the galaxy has decided to test old promises." Around him, engines that had rested for generations began to wake, and deep within the heart of human space, a fleet built for exactly this moment began to move. Space does not warn you before it changes. One moment, the region beyond the silence line was empty, marked on old maps as forgotten and lifeless. The next moment, it was full of ships that had not been seen by anyone outside human space in 300 years. Grand Marshal Tavis Rin's scouts spotted the new fleet first. Reports came in fast, one after another, each one harder to believe than the last. Dozens of warships had appeared out of nowhere near the ruins of the captured outpost, moving with a kind of order that unsettled even veteran officers. Tavis Rin dismissed the first reports as exaggeration. He had just won an easy victory. He was not ready to believe that victory had cost him something far greater than one small colony. Aboard the lead human warship, Admiral Elias Bowen studied the wreckage of the outpost through his viewport without any visible emotion. Beside him stood Captain Nadia Okafor, watching the same scene with narrowed eyes. She had trained her whole life for a moment like this, yet nothing about it felt like the story she had grown up hearing. It looked smaller, sadder, more real. Bowen gave a simple order: "Open a channel to the Dominion fleet." When the connection opened, his voice was calm, almost gentle, though every word carried weight. "This outpost belonged to people who never threatened you. You attacked it without warning, and you took prisoners who could not defend themselves. Withdraw your fleet now, release everyone you captured, and no further action will be taken against you." Tavis Rin laughed when the message reached his bridge. To him, it sounded less like a threat and more like a plea from a weaker power trying to save face. He ordered his officers to prepare a response, one meant to remind these strange newcomers exactly who controlled this part of the galaxy. Dominion ships moved into attack formation, weapons charging, confident in their numbers and their experience. Bowen waited exactly as long as his warning required, no longer. When the Dominion fleet opened fire first, he gave a single quiet order to his own ships: "Begin." What followed was not a battle in the way the Dominion understood battles. There was no long exchange of fire, no slow grind between two evenly matched forces. Human ships moved together with a kind of precision that seemed almost rehearsed, each vessel covering another, each strike aimed with purpose instead of anger. Dominion warships that had won dozens of campaigns against lesser powers found themselves outmaneuvered within minutes, their formations broken apart before they could even understand what was happening to them. Captain Nadia Okafor guided her ship through the chaos with practiced calm, giving orders in short, clear bursts. Around her, the crew moved like a single machine, trained for exactly this kind of engagement, though none of them had ever truly expected to use that training in real combat. She watched enemy ships fall from her screen one after another, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, careful focus that left no room for celebration. Tavis Rin realized too late that his fleet was not simply losing. It was being dismantled. He gave the order to retreat, but by then, half of his ships were already gone, torn apart by an enemy that fought with a strange kind of restraint, striking exactly enough to disable, never more than necessary unless resistance continued. Only a handful of Dominion ships escaped the battle, carrying survivors and sensor logs that made no sense compared to anything in their archives. No weapon signatures matched known human technology from old historical records. No tactics matched the outdated war doctrines still taught in Dominion academies as ancient history. Whatever this fleet was, it was not the same humanity remembered by faded legends. Aboard the human flagship, Admiral Bowen watched the retreating Dominion ships without ordering pursuit. Okafor glanced at him, surprised. "We could destroy the rest of them," she said quietly. Bowen shook his head. "We are not here to erase an enemy. We are here to answer a question the galaxy asked when it crossed our border. Let them carry that answer home." Down in the ruins of the outpost, rescue teams moved quickly through the wreckage, searching for survivors. Owen Fairweather was found still alive, huddled beneath a collapsed section of his old workstation, more frightened than injured. When human soldiers pulled him free, he could barely believe what he was seeing. These were not soldiers from old stories or half-remembered lessons. They were real, calm, and quietly efficient, treating the rescue with the same careful precision they had shown in battle only minutes earlier. As the last Dominion ships disappeared into deep space, word of what had happened began spreading far faster than any single fleet could travel. A message would soon reach systems that had spent 3 centuries believing humanity was either extinct or irrelevant. That message carried no exaggeration and needed none. A single battle had ended almost as quickly as it began, and the galaxy that had grown used to underestimating an old, quiet border was about to learn exactly how wrong it had been. On a quiet research world near the center of Vantrial Concord space, an archivist named Isildoran spent most days surrounded by records too old for most people to care about anymore. Her people, the Sarai, were known across the galaxy for their long memories, keeping records that stretched back further than most civilizations had existed at all. Most of her colleagues considered her fascination with ancient human history a harmless hobby, the kind of thing kept alive only by scholars with too much free time. That changed within a single day. News of the battle beyond the Silence Line spread through Concord space faster than any official channel could control. Traders passing near Dominion territory picked up fragments of the story first, each version slightly different from the last, each one somehow more unbelievable than the one before. By the time the reports reached the Concord Council, the story had already grown into something between fact and legend. A single human fleet had appeared from nowhere and destroyed a Dominion battle group in minutes. First Speaker Halvin called an emergency session the moment verified sensor data arrived. She had led the council for over a decade, guiding careful, patient diplomacy between dozens of very different species. She had also spent years quietly worried about a subject most of her colleagues preferred to ignore. What might happen if humanity, hidden so completely for 3 centuries, ever decided to reappear? The council chamber was louder than usual that day. Younger delegates argued that the reports had to be exaggerated, that no single fleet could destroy a modern Dominion battle group so quickly without heavy losses of its own. Older delegates, especially those whose species had records stretching back far enough to remember the original human war, said very little. Their silence spoke louder than any argument the younger delegates could offer. Halvin turned to Isildoran, who had been quietly invited to the session because of her research. "Tell them what your archives say," she said simply. Isil stood, feeling every eye in the chamber turn toward her. She had spent years studying fragments of the old war, pulling together pieces of information scattered across dozens of old archives, most of it heavily damaged or deliberately incomplete. What she knew was limited, but it was enough to silence the room completely. Humanity did not simply win their old war, she explained. They survived something that came very close to destroying them entirely. Full details of what they fought remain unclear even in our oldest records, but the aftermath is well documented. Entire star systems were left completely empty. Populations that once numbered in the billions disappeared from historical counts within a single generation. When the war finally ended, humanity did not celebrate. They withdrew, built their border, and made it very clear they wanted no further contact with anyone. A younger delegate interrupted, asking why. If humanity had won such a costly war, they would not want allies to help prevent something similar from happening again. Isil considered the question carefully before answering. Perhaps, she said, they learned that allies were not always enough. Perhaps they decided the safest path was simply not to be found at all. The council fell into a long, uneasy silence. Halvin finally spoke again, her voice calm despite the tension in the room. Whatever the reasons behind their isolation, humanity is no longer hidden. The Dominion crossed a border that clearly still matters to them, and they answered that action with a level of force none of us anticipated. We cannot afford to guess at their intentions from old stories and secondhand reports. We need direct contact, conducted carefully, by someone who understands both the history and the stakes involved. She looked directly at Isildoran. You will lead our delegation. Isil had spent her career surrounded by old records and dusty archives, never expecting to step beyond the quiet walls of her research facility. The idea of standing face to face with the very civilization she had spent years studying from a safe distance was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Still, she understood the importance of what Halvin was asking. If anyone in Concord space had a chance of understanding humanity's intentions clearly, it would need to be someone who had already spent years trying to understand their past. Meanwhile, far beyond Concord borders, the Corveth Dominion Council received a very different kind of report. Survivors from the battle described an enemy fleet that fought with impossible precision, striking exactly hard enough to win without excessive destruction. Some Dominion leaders saw this restraint as weakness, an opportunity waiting to be exploited by a larger, better-prepared invasion force. Others saw it as something far more dangerous, a level of control that suggested humanity had far more power in reserve than they had shown. Grand Marshal Tavis Rin stood before his own council, defending his failed campaign while quietly nursing a growing sense of unease he refused to admit out loud. Whatever humanity truly was, one battle had already changed the balance of power across an entire region of space, and both the Concord and the Dominion now found themselves preparing for a future none of their old strategies had ever accounted for. 300 years before the battle at the edge of the Silence Line, an enemy fleet unlike anything humanity had recorded before appeared without warning at the edge of a colony called Ashgrove. Nobody living now remembered exactly why the attack began or what the enemy truly wanted, only that when it finally ended, entire star systems sat empty of light, and survivors spoke of a war fought not for territory, but for something closer to extinction. Historical fragments call it only the Long Silence War. Most of humanity chooses not to speak of it more than that. Dr. Rowan Kessler had spent years studying what little remained of those old records, more out of professional curiosity than any personal connection to the events themselves. Now, standing aboard Admiral Bowen's flagship, surrounded by fresh reports from the battle at the outpost, that old curiosity had turned into something far more urgent. "We built the Silence Line because we learned something painful," Kessler explained during a private briefing with Bowen and Okafor. "We learned that even total victory can look almost identical to total loss, if the cost is high enough." Humanity did not isolate itself out of fear of other species. It isolated itself because the war it survived showed exactly how fragile survival really is, no matter how strong you think you are. Okafor listened carefully, arms crossed, clearly turning the words over in her mind. "If that is true," she said, "then why respond to the Dominion at all? Why not simply let them retreat and continue watching from behind our border, the way we always have?" Bowen answered before Kessler could. "Because silence only works as long as nobody tests it," he said. "The moment someone crosses that line and survives without consequence, the whole purpose of the border disappears. We did not choose this conflict. We simply chose not to ignore it once it found us." Meanwhile, deep within Corveth Dominion space, Grand Marshal Tavis Rin faced growing pressure from council members eager to erase the embarrassment of his failed campaign. Some argued for a full invasion, convinced that the human fleet's restraint during battle proved a limited arsenal rather than genuine control. Others, quieter and more cautious, argued that no civilization capable of coordinating such a precise, disciplined strike could possibly be as limited as their optimism suggested. Tavis Rin found himself caught between pride and growing doubt. He had built his entire career on decisive victories against weaker powers, and the idea of admitting real uncertainty felt almost impossible. Yet privately, reviewing sensor logs from the battle over and over, he could not ignore how carefully human ships had avoided unnecessary destruction. An enemy truly desperate or truly weak rarely showed that kind of discipline in the middle of combat. At the edge of human space, Isildoran's small diplomatic ship finally crossed into the region long marked on Concord maps as forbidden territory. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, reviewing everything her archives contained, yet nothing fully prepared her for what she found waiting on the other side of the Silence Line. Human space was not the empty, decayed remnant many in the Concord quietly expected. Instead, she found carefully maintained systems, quiet trade routes between human colonies, and a level of order that suggested a civilization that had spent centuries building patiently rather than simply hiding in fear. When her ship was met by a small human escort fleet, The officers aboard were courteous but firm, guiding her toward a meeting with representatives from Bowen's command rather than any political capital. Isel was brought aboard the flagship and introduced to Dr. Rowan Kessler, who greeted her with quiet curiosity rather than suspicion. For the first time in centuries, someone from outside human space sat face to face with someone willing to speak openly about the past. "You study the long silence war," Kessler said, glancing at the data files Isel carried. "So do I, in a way. Perhaps between the two of us, we can finally piece together a fuller picture than either side has managed alone." Isel felt a mixture of excitement and caution as she considered the offer. Whatever true history lay behind humanity's long isolation, she now understood it carried consequences far beyond old academic curiosity. Every fragment of truth uncovered here would shape decisions being made right now by leaders on both sides of a border that had just been tested for the first time in living memory. Far above them, Admiral Bowen watched quiet reports scroll across his display, tracking early signs of renewed Dominion fleet movement near the border. Whatever understanding might grow between Kessler and Isildoran, he understood clearly that history alone would not stop what was likely coming next. Deep within Dominion territory, an entire shipyard worked without rest for weeks, assembling one of the largest invasion fleets the Corvette Dominion had built in generations. Grand Marshal Tavis Wren had convinced the Council that the earlier defeat was a mistake born from underestimation, not weakness on their part. This time, he promised, there would be no mistake. New weapons, designed specifically using data recovered from the first battle, would break through whatever tactics the humans relied on before. Not everyone on the Council agreed with his confidence. A few quiet voices warned that building an entire strategy around a single battle's data was dangerous, especially against an enemy who clearly understood restraint as well as force. Those voices were overruled. Ambition, as always within the Dominion, spoke louder than caution. Word of the coming invasion reached human space through quiet channels long before Dominion ships crossed the silence line. Admiral Bowen received the intelligence report calmly, though the scale of the coming fleet was far larger than anything faced during the first engagement. Around him, Captain Nadia Okafor studied the projected numbers with a tight, focused expression, aware that this battle would test far more than tactics alone. Owen Fairweather, still recovering from his time as a prisoner during the first attack, had chosen to stay with the fleet rather than return to civilian life. He had asked to help in whatever way he could, and Bowen, recognizing the value of first-hand experience, assigned him to assist coordination teams tracking Dominion fleet movement. It was not the life Owen had imagined for himself only weeks earlier, but something in him refused to simply watch from the sidelines a second time. When the Dominion invasion fleet finally crossed the silence line, its size alone was meant to send a clear message. Hundreds of warships moved in tight formation, backed by new weapon systems built to counter the precision tactics that had destroyed the earlier scouting fleet. Tavis Wren commanded from his flagship with quiet confidence, certain that overwhelming numbers combined with updated technology would finally settle the question of who truly controlled this region of space. Admiral Bowen met the invasion with a fleet far smaller in number, though every ship moved with the same careful discipline shown during the first battle. Rather than meeting the Dominion fleet head-on, human ships spread out along carefully chosen positions, using the terrain of a nearby asteroid field to break apart the enemy's tight formation before real fighting even began. The battle that followed was longer and far more difficult than the first encounter. Dominion weapons, upgraded specifically to counter human tactics, forced Bowen's fleet to adapt in real time, shifting formations and strategies as the fight unfolded. Okafor coordinated multiple squadrons at once, her voice steady even as damage reports began arriving from several ships under her command. For the first time since the war began, humanity's fleet faced real losses, a reminder that even careful discipline could not fully erase the cost of battle. In the middle of the fighting, sensor teams picked up something unexpected drifting far beyond the edge of the battlefield, a faint signal unlike anything belonging to either the Dominion or human fleets. Rowan Kessler, monitoring data from a secure position aboard the flagship, recognized fragments of the pattern almost immediately from old, damaged records buried deep within human archives. It matched signatures once associated with the original enemy from the Long Silence War, a threat humanity had hoped, perhaps foolishly, was gone for good. Bowen received the report in the middle of active combat, forced to weigh a decision with consequences reaching far beyond the current battle. If the signal was accurate, both human and Dominion forces might be fighting each other, while something far more dangerous quietly observed from the shadows. There was no time to confirm the theory fully. There was only time to end the current battle as quickly and decisively as possible. He gave new orders, shifting tactics toward a faster, more direct engagement rather than the slow, careful approach used earlier. Human ships pressed forward with renewed intensity, targeting key Dominion command vessels rather than spreading damage evenly across the enemy fleet. Tavis Rin, watching his formation collapse faster than expected, finally understood that his new weapons had bought him time, not victory. Facing the total destruction of his fleet, Tavis Rin made the hardest decision of his career and ordered a full retreat, abandoning the invasion entirely rather than risk complete annihilation. As Dominion ships scattered back across the Silence Line, Bowen once again chose not to pursue beyond the border, though this time his reasoning carried a heavier weight than simple restraint. Somewhere beyond both fleets, the strange signal Kessler detected faded quietly into the dark, leaving behind only a lingering question neither side was fully prepared to answer. Peace, when it finally came, arrived quietly, without parades or grand announcements, much like everything else humanity had done since reopening its border to the wider galaxy. Word of the Dominion's costly retreat spread quickly through Concord space, though this time the reaction carried less panic and more careful reassessment. An empire that many had quietly feared for generations had just been stopped twice by a fleet fighting with clear restraint rather than raw aggression, and that fact alone forced difficult conversations across dozens of star systems. Within the Corvette Dominion, the failed invasion triggered exactly the kind of political turmoil Tavis Rin had feared most. Council members who once supported his aggressive expansion quickly distanced themselves from the disaster, eager to avoid sharing responsibility for such a costly defeat. Tavis Rin was formally removed from active command within weeks, replaced by a more cautious leadership willing to explore diplomacy rather than risk a third confrontation with an enemy still not fully understood. It was not the ending he had imagined for his career, though privately, watching reports of the strange signal detected during the final battle, he found himself almost relieved the Dominion had chosen to step back before something far worse became involved. In the Concord capital, First Speaker Halvin presented Isildurann's full report to the council, this time met with far less argument than before. The evidence was simply too clear to dismiss. Humanity had not reappeared to conquer or dominate the wider galaxy. They had reappeared because their border was tested, and they had responded with exactly the amount of force required to end that test quickly. Halvin formally proposed opening careful, structured diplomatic relations with human space, an idea that passed the council with far more support than she had expected only weeks earlier. Isilduran remained aboard Admiral Bowen's flagship during the final negotiations, working closely with Dr. Rowan Kessler to prepare a joint historical record combining fragments from both Concord and human archives. For the first time in 3 centuries, pieces of the old Long Silence War were being properly documented rather than left scattered and half-forgotten across separate, isolated collections. It was slow, careful work, but Isil found a strange kind of satisfaction in finally understanding a history she had studied from a distance for most of her career. You never fully explained why your people chose silence instead of alliance after the old war, she said one evening, reviewing data alongside Kessler in a quiet section of the flagship. Surely allies could have helped rebuild faster. Kessler considered the question carefully before answering. Perhaps, he said, or perhaps we learned that the wrong kind of attention can be more dangerous than isolation ever was. Whatever fought us during the long silence were left barely enough of us standing to remember what happened. We chose quiet rebuilding over visible strength because visible strength invites exactly the kind of testing we just experienced. Now that the test has happened, and we survived it without losing ourselves in the process, perhaps a different kind of future is finally possible. Aboard the same flagship, Owen Fairweather stood near a viewport, watching the stars outside with a calm he had not felt since before the Dominion attack on his home. He had been offered a permanent position within the fleet's civilian support division, a chance to use his engineering background for something far larger than quiet colony maintenance. After everything he had witnessed, the offer felt less like an opportunity and more like a responsibility he could not walk away from. Captain Nadia Okafor found him there during a quiet moment between duties. "You did well out there," she said simply. "Most people who go through what you experienced want nothing more than to disappear afterward." Owen considered her words for a long moment. "My grandmother used to say real strength isn't about disappearing or standing in the spotlight," he said. "It's about being ready when it actually matters." I think I finally understand what she meant. Admiral Elias Bowen stood alone later that evening, reviewing final reports from the peace negotiations now underway between human representatives and the Vantrial Concord. The silence line remained on every star chart, unchanged in its position, though its meaning had shifted completely. It was no longer a wall meant to hide humanity from a galaxy that had forgotten them. It had become, instead, a clear boundary respected by choice rather than fear, crossed now by careful agreement instead of secrecy or force. Yet even as formal peace talks continued, Bowen could not fully set aside the strange signal detected during the last battle, quietly fading into the dark edges of known space. Whatever old enemy had once pushed humanity toward isolation might still exist somewhere beyond current maps, watching in silence, just as humanity once had. For now, that question remained unanswered, filed carefully alongside other unresolved mysteries left over from the long silence war. Bowen allowed himself a rare, quiet moment of satisfaction, watching human and Concord ships share the same patch of space for the first time in generations. Whatever waited beyond the edges of known space would eventually reveal itself in its own time. For now, the galaxy finally had the answer it had been missing for 300 years, and humanity, no longer silent, stood ready to shape whatever came next.